California had always seemed like a dream to me, a destination full of opportunities, stunning landscapes, and unforgettable experiences. Growing up in a small town where every day felt the same, I longed for something different. I imagined the sunny streets of Los Angeles, the majestic mountains, and the vibrant coastal communities calling me, inviting me to leave my monotonous life behind and discover something new. For a long time, I thought about taking a trip, but I always found reasons to postpone it. Work, money, or just fear of the unknown. But that year, everything seemed to align. I had saved enough, accumulated vacation days, and felt an urgent need to escape. It was now or never. So, I booked a flight to California, excited to explore Los Angeles and all the places I had dreamed about. I arrived in California full of anticipation. I had planned my itinerary carefully, from walking along the beaches of Santa Monica to watching sunsets at Venice Beach. My first few days were everything I had hoped for and more. Food from local restaurants, walking along the boardwalk, visiting the Santa Monica Pier, and marveling at luxury shops on Rodeo Drive. I was so lost in the beauty of it all that I forgot about the problems I had left behind. On the third day, I decided to venture beyond the beaches and explore downtown Los Angeles. I had heard about its skyscrapers, museums, markets, and the cultural mix that made it so unique. I wanted to feel the energy of the city at its heart. I took a bus from Venice to downtown and found exactly what I had imagined. The bustling streets, the street vendors, the skyscrapers reflecting the sun. I was lost in the crowd, enjoying every moment. After lunch, I continued walking aimlessly, letting my feet take me wherever they wanted. As I ventured deeper into the city, I began to notice a change. The streets became emptier, the buildings older, more neglected. The lively atmosphere faded. Part of me sensed something was wrong, but I ignored it. I kept walking, convincing myself I was about to discover some hidden gem. But the truth was, I was walking into a trap, a place no one should find themselves, especially alone. The sun started to set, and shadows stretched across the streets. That's when I noticed a car slowly passing by. At first, I didn't pay much attention, but a chill ran down my spine when the car circled back and stopped beside me. There were 3 men inside. Their gazes were cold, calculating. My heart pounded. Without thinking, I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction. The car followed. Before I could run, a hand grabbed my arm, throwing me to the ground. I tried to scream, but they covered my mouth with a cloth that smelled of chemicals. Everything became blurry as the world around me faded. The next thing I remember is waking up in a dark room, my wrists and ankles bound tightly to a chair. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and something rancid. Terror washed over me as I realized I had been kidnapped. I had no idea where I was or what they wanted from me. The door creaked open and 3 men entered, my captors. One of them, the leader, smiled cruelly as he told me, "Here, the rules don't exist. You are whatever we want you to be." My heart raced as they dragged me to another room with a metal table in the center. What followed were days of unimaginable horror, physical and mental torture that shattered me. They burned me with cigarettes, cut me with razor blades, and degraded me in ways I can't describe. But there was one man who was different. He didn't enjoy my suffering as much as the others. He stayed in the background, watching with an expression I couldn't understand. At first, I thought he was just waiting for his turn, but over time, I noticed something different. His hands would tremble slightly when he touched me, as if he was in conflict with himself. One night, after what felt like an eternity, he came into the room alone. His expression was serious. Without a word, he untied me and helped me to my feet. I was too weak to walk, but he guided me out of the building and into a car parked nearby. He whispered, "Go. Get out of here. Don't look back." I didn't know if he was driving or if someone else was, but all I remember is the car speeding away from that hell. When it finally stopped, someone helped me out and told me to wait. I collapsed on a bench, my strength gone. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital, safe but broken. The police questioned me, but I couldn't remember much. My mind had blocked out parts of the nightmare. They found the abandoned house where I had been held, but the men were gone, and the place had been burned to erase any evidence. The physical wounds healed over time, but the mental scars run deep. Therapy helped, but I will never be the same. Even now, years later, I live with fear and anxiety, haunted by what happened in California. I never told my friends and family the full truth, only that I had been in an accident. It's a burden I carry alone. Sometimes I wonder why that man let me go. Was it regret, guilt, or something else? I'll never know. But I survived, and for that I am grateful. Every day I wake up, I remind myself that I am still here. I'm a survivor. Even though the fear still lingers, so does hope. My boyfriend and I decided to take a road trip from our house in Sacramento down to Los Angeles to visit his family. We thought it would be a nice change of scenery, and we'd been wanting to see the coast again. We knew we wanted to take the Pacific Coast Highway, PCH, because it's stunning. It runs along the entire coast of California and is considered one of the most beautiful drives you can take. We'd both done it before with our families when we were younger, but this would be the first time doing it together. I was so excited that I packed my suitcase a week before we even left. My boyfriend was excited too, though maybe not as much as I was, since he'd be doing the drive to LA, and I'd be driving back. The day of our departure came, and we planned to leave early, but as always happens, we ended up leaving around 2 p.m. The drive started off pretty slow. It took us about 3 hours to get through the traffic in San Jose before we finally reached Gilroy, where we turned toward the coast. We made a quick stop in Gilroy, which is famous for its garlic. For those who don't know, they grow a lot of garlic there and even have a garlic festival every year. You can literally smell it in the air as you drive through the city with the windows down. We tried the touristy garlic ice cream, which was surprisingly okay, and some other garlic-themed foods. It was a fun little break. By 5:30 p.m., we were back on the road, heading toward the Pacific Coast Highway. After another hour, we were finally driving along the coast, and it was just as breathtaking as I remembered. California's beaches are something else. But there was one problem: we hadn't taken into account that it was fall, nearing winter, and the sun was setting pretty early. It was getting dark, and that made it harder to enjoy the views we had been so excited for. The ocean looked a little angry too, which added to our disappointment. As the sky darkened, my boyfriend and I decided to pull into a small RV parking area next to the beach to sleep for the night. It wasn't an actual campsite or anything, but there were only a few people around, and we didn't think it would be a problem. We had brought snacks for the trip, so we weren't too upset about not being able to get food anywhere. We were just happy to be together, and I couldn't wait to see the sunrise over the water the next morning. Our car wasn't exactly ideal for sleeping in. It was a Honda Civic, not a truck or SUV, but we made do. I reclined the seats, and we wrapped ourselves in the blankets we'd brought. My boyfriend cracked the window slightly to let in some fresh air, and we drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, my boyfriend suddenly woke up. He'd heard a tapping on the window. The glass was fogged up from condensation, so it was hard to see out, but he rubbed it clear. He shook me awake, asking if I'd heard the noise, but I hadn't. We heard it again, a knock on his side window. When he cleared the condensation, we could barely make out the figure of a person standing outside. That's when we realized we were in serious trouble. There were 3 men standing outside the car. The one closest to my boyfriend reached into his pants and showed a gun. There was just glass between my boyfriend and that gun, but that wouldn't have stopped a bullet. Somehow, despite being terrified, my boyfriend had the courage to reach for the car keys and start the engine. The men didn't like that. One of them screamed at my boyfriend to get out of the car or they'd kill us. That's when the man with the gun stuck the barrel into the small crack in the window and pointed it directly at me. I was shaking, crying, and begging my boyfriend to do something, but there was nothing we could do. They clearly weren't bluffing. In what I can only describe as an act of terrified wisdom, my boyfriend unlocked the doors. Almost immediately, they dragged him out of the car and started beating him. I watched in horror as they threw him to the ground and kicked him. His stomach, legs, arms, even his head. He kept screaming for them to stop, but they didn't care. In the chaos, he managed to look at me, beaten and bloody, but without a word, I knew what he was telling me. He wanted me to run. As quietly as I could, I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my door, and slipped out. I didn't bother closing it. Doing so would have made too much noise. The sand crunched softly beneath my feet as I moved toward a small section of the beach covered in large rocks. I knew that if I could make it there, I might have a chance to hide and survive. Just as I reached the rocks, I heard the men yelling that they were missing one. One of them was shouting, "Find her!" I hid between the rocks, half of my body submerged in cold, dark water. I had no idea what else might be in the water with me, but it didn't matter. I had no choice. I held my breath, trying to stay as still and silent as possible. One of the men climbed over the rocks, calling out to me. He said they wouldn't hurt me, that everything would be fine, and I could join my boyfriend. There was no way I believed that. He got closer and closer, but suddenly, I heard him fall. He cursed loudly, and after a moment, I heard him shout to the others that he couldn't find me. Eventually, he walked away. When I was sure he was gone, I carefully peeked out from my hiding spot. The moon was bright enough for me to see the parking area. I saw the men getting into our car and speeding away. And there, on the ground, was my boyfriend, completely still. I ran back to him as fast as I could. He was still breathing, but unconscious. Both our phones were in the car that had just been stolen, so I had no way to call for help. I ran to the nearest RV, which was a little ways away, and banged on the door. After what felt like forever, someone answered. I used their phone to call the police, and they sent an ambulance. My boyfriend was airlifted to the hospital. His injuries were so severe. He had internal bleeding, a collapsed lung, and multiple broken bones. He was in surgery for hours and spent months recovering in the hospital. Thankfully, by some miracle, he made a full recovery. As for the men who attacked us, they were never caught. A few months later, the chassis of our car was found, completely dismantled and obviously sold for parts. I wish I could say there was a better outcome, that the men were arrested and justice was served. But that's not what happened. Maybe one day, but for now, I'm just thankful that we both made it out alive. I'm 25 now, but when everything happened, I had just turned 17. I grew up in a small city in Southern California called Camarillo. I guess it's not that small, but compared to other cities around here, it feels pretty tiny. It's about 100 kilometers from Los Angeles, and most people come here for the outlet malls. But when you grow up here, it's just boring. I never had the money to go anywhere outside Ventura County, so I was forced to find things to do close to home. I grew up with just my dad. My mom left when I was around 3 years old, and my dad raised me and my sister. He was a good dad, just really busy. It's expensive to live here, so he worked 3 jobs and wasn't home much. That meant my sister and I had a lot of time to get into trouble. We both started smoking and drinking around the age of 13, and my sister began dating a guy much older than her. My dad never found out. By the time he came home at night, he was so exhausted that he'd just collapse into bed. He made sure we had a roof over our heads and food to eat, but he didn't really get involved in the rest of our lives. I dropped out of high school when I was 16. I didn't have any friends going to Camarillo High with me, and I lived on the Rio Mesa side of town in Oxnard. If you're from the area, you know what I mean. Going to school every day became such a hassle, and I just got tired of it all. My sister and I became really close, and I was a bad influence on her. I convinced her to drop out when she turned 16, too. I regret that now. We started partying almost every night. My sister had a lot of older friends because of her boyfriend, so it was easy for us to find somewhere to go when we wanted to get out of the house. One night, her boyfriend took us to a friend's house in Oxnard. He told us it was just a small gathering, but when we got there, the place was packed. Hundreds of people crammed into this tiny house in a sketchy neighborhood. I like a good time, but this wasn't it. I was pressing up against sweaty bodies just to get to the kitchen for a drink. I told my sister I wanted to leave, but when she asked her boyfriend to take me home, he refused. He said there was a guy inside he had to do business with and told us to wait in the car. We sat there for almost an hour, talking about nothing, waiting for him. Then we heard something, yelling, footsteps. Everything turned to chaos. A A group of men were coming out of the house and getting into a car, clearly chasing after us. I begged my sister's boyfriend to stop, to just let me and my sister out, but he kept driving, telling us we were part of this now and whatever happened to him would happen to us too. He managed to lose the car that was following us, and for a moment, I felt a bit relieved. That feeling didn't last long. He pulled up to another house in a nicer part of town. We all got out of the car, and though I wanted to run, I couldn't. He knocked on the door, and an old woman answered. She didn't ask many questions, just sighed and let us in. She called for someone, and a man came downstairs a few minutes later. My sister and her boyfriend went into another room to talk with him. I tried to listen, but I couldn't make out much. My sister's face, though, it told me everything. She knew exactly what was happening. I looked at her, trying to find the right words to ask what she had gotten us into. Shouting wouldn't work, so I asked as calmly as I could. After what felt like forever, she finally told me. "He sells meth," she said. "We're here so he can return the drugs he stole from the guys at the party." Couldn't believe it. We were in the house of her boyfriend's drug supplier. They had been at that party to steal meth, and now we were caught up in this mess. I was scared out of my mind, trying to hold it together, but the anxiety was piling up. All I could think about was my dad, how hard he worked for us, how much he sacrificed, and here I was possibly about to die because of some stupid decision. I could only imagine what would go through his head if he lost both of his daughters. Her boyfriend eventually finished his business, but he still wouldn't take us home. Instead, he took us to some other spot where he sold drugs. We sat there with him for 4 hours while people came in and out, buying from him. Some of them even asked if they could buy me and my sister, like we were property. Worst of all, I could tell he was actually considering it. I felt so disgusted and angry at him, but mostly at my sister. She had put us in this situation, and she should have known better. Finally, around 4 in the morning, he dropped us off at home. I went straight to my room, closed the door, and cried for the rest of the night. It was like a switch flipped in my head. That night made me regret all the decisions that had led me there. It made me appreciate my dad more than I ever had before, but it also changed my relationship with my sister forever. Later that year, my sister moved in with her boyfriend. I tried to convince her not to, but she didn't listen. My dad and I haven't spoken to her in years. The last we heard, she and her boyfriend were arrested for possession with intent to distribute. That was about a year ago. I can't help but feel partially responsible for the way her life turned out. I've tried reaching out to her, but nothing ever comes of it. I realized something recently. I survived that night, but somehow my sister never did. Marissa and I decided to go camping at Yosemite in May 2016. I was 25 years old and newly married that summer, and she was 30, looking for an excuse to take a break from her responsibilities as a mom. Marissa loved her kids, but being a mother sometimes got overwhelming, so she needed a break. We lived close to each other in Redding, California, and planned to drive together to Yosemite. We reserved one of the last spots available in the campground where we had agreed to stay, hoping to spend at least 4 days hiking and getting away from everyday life. When we finally arrived at our campsite, we were relieved that it wasn't too close to the others. A few trees separated our space from the rest, giving us some privacy. We decided on setting up a tent, but also brought air mattresses to ensure we weren't too uncomfortable. Many campers around us had RVs or trailers, but we tried not to feel out of place. Directly to our right was a family of 5. A man named Teo, his wife Luisa, and their 3 kids, all under 10 years old. Their presence was comforting since, as 2 women camping alone, it was nice to know a family was nearby. On our left were 2 men in their 30s named Taylor and Mateo. They introduced themselves after Teo's family did, but their approach was not as welcome. They took Teo's family introducing themselves as an invitation and wandered over to us, bringing their chairs and sitting close to where we were setting up our tent. They kept drinking beers while bombarding us with questions, most of them about why we didn't have husbands with us. At one point, Mateo made a comment that sent chills down my spine. "Beautiful women like you shouldn't be camping alone like this." Don't you know there are men who would take a sweet opportunity like this? His words, especially the use of sweet opportunity, really unnerved me. I started getting a bad feeling about these guys, but didn't want to ruin the trip by mentioning it to Marissa. I made a mental note to keep an eye on them and decided I'd tell her if anything else happened. Unfortunately, the situation escalated that very night. While we sat by our campfire, Taylor and Mateo returned, drunk and more obnoxious than before. Mateo sat next to me, much too close for comfort, and put his arm around my shoulder. The stench coming from his armpit was disgusting, and it made me want to vomit. I glanced at Marissa and saw that she wasn't doing much better. Taylor had his hand firmly placed on her thigh. We both sat in shock for a few moments before we mustered the courage to get up and leave. We went straight to the ranger's office to report what had happened. To our surprise, the rangers took the situation very seriously and offered to call the police. Marissa and I insisted that just having them kicked out of the park would be enough. The rangers escorted us back to our camp and removed Taylor and Mateo from the premises. Feeling safer, we went to sleep that night, looking forward to the days ahead. The next day, we spent time with Teo's family, who had invited us on a hike. They were amazing people, and it was a shame that they had to leave later that afternoon to head back home. Strangely, the campsites on either side of us remained empty that night. As dusk fell, something felt off, but I tried to shake it. It was around 11 p.m., and we were in our tent, lying in complete darkness, when I heard voices outside. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they were close. I turned on my flashlight to see outside and ensure we weren't completely vulnerable. Our tent was closed with a zipper, but from inside, I could hear someone fiddling with it. I listened as twigs snapped and leaves rustled under their footsteps. My heart started racing. I woke Marissa up, whispering, "There's someone outside." We heard more noise, louder now, as if someone was cutting through the tent. Sure enough, they were slicing through the fabric with something sharp. I could see the outline of the tear getting larger. My heart pounded in my chest, and panic set in. But then I remembered, I had brought a baseball bat with me, just in case something like this happened. I grabbed the bat from next to the air mattress and waited, barely breathing. When I saw the head of the intruder poke through the hole, I swung the bat as hard as I could. The sound of it hitting his head was like nothing I'd ever heard before. He fell to the ground instantly. Whoever was with him ran off before I could react. Marissa and I quickly recognized the man as Matthew, one of the men from earlier. He was bleeding from his head, and we wasted no time calling the police. Matthew was taken away in an ambulance, handcuffed to the stretcher, and they found Taylor nearby, attempting to flee on an ATV. Both men were arrested. During the investigation, police uncovered text messages where they had planned to take revenge on us for getting them kicked out of the park. They were charged with harassment and malicious intent. But to our disappointment, both received less than a year in jail and 2 years of probation. Thankfully, they lived in another state far from us. Marissa and I decided that, after this ordeal, we would never camp alone again. I live in Indiana and work in a very boring job that takes up way more time than I would like. A word of advice: if you're choosing a profession or career, make sure you pick something you love. Don't just do something for the paycheck because you'll end up miserable. I learned that the hard way. This story took place about 15 years ago when I was in my late 20s. I had accumulated a bunch of vacation days, so I decided to take a trip to Southern California in hopes of escaping the fact that I absolutely hated my life. Part of me wanted to go there and never return, as there was nothing holding me in Indiana. I flew to San Diego with plans to drive up the coast to Santa Barbara over the course of a week. I rented a car and intended to visit as many beaches and restaurants as I could, based on what I had read in various online blogs. There were so many travel bloggers back then. After picking up the rental car, I drove straight to Pacific Beach. I didn't have a hotel reservation, but I figured I'd find something without too much trouble. That first day, I spent my time walking along the 3-mile-long strip of sand, enjoying the sun and watching the waves. That night, I had dinner at a Mexican restaurant, where I asked the server if they knew of a quieter beach I could visit to avoid the touristy crowds. The The server didn't seem to know, and I was about to leave when a guy sitting nearby said he knew of a spot further up the coast, past Highway 5. He warned that not many people went there because of a few shark attacks in recent years. Although none were fatal, the mention of sharks made me a little uneasy. However, he assured me the last attack had been over a year ago and that he had surfed there many times since with no problems. Intrigued, I decided to check it out. We exchanged information, and he said I could follow him there the next morning. It was then I realized my lack of planning had caught up with me. Every hotel was full, likely because of a convention in town. I ended up staying in a rundown motel that charged by the hour. I was sure I'd catch some kind of disease just from being in the room, or that mice would crawl over me in the night. It was so unbearable that I checked out early and decided to sleep in my car. The next morning couldn't come fast enough. I met up with the guy whose name was Jose and followed him to the beach. He told me the roads got tricky as we neared the coast, and he wasn't kidding. As we turned off the highway, the road became narrower and bumpier, but I was excited as we got closer to the water. We arrived, and Jose pulled surfboards out of the back of his truck, offering me a paddleboard to use. I gladly accepted, despite the teasing from him and his friends about my long-sleeve rash guard, which had black and white stripes on the front and back. I didn't care. I was just eager to get on the water. After a few struggles, I managed to balance on the paddleboard and drifted about 30 meters from the shore, enjoying the sun and the peaceful scenery. Then, I saw a shadow pass underneath me. At first, I thought it was a dolphin and started yelling excitedly to the other guys surfing nearby. But they didn't hear me. They just pointed to their ears and shook their heads, signaling they couldn't hear over the waves. I stayed out on the water for about an hour before I saw the surfers getting out and packing up. Confused, I paddled back to shore and asked Jose why they were leaving so early. It was only about 2 p.m., but he explained that one of their friends, Angel, had just gotten a call saying his mom was in the hospital. They had to leave. He told me I could keep using the paddleboard and just leave it behind some bushes when I was done. Not long after they left, I saw the shadow again. This time it was much bigger and closer. I started to worry that it wasn't a dolphin after all. Suddenly, I remembered what Jose had said the night before about the shark attacks. Panic began to set in as I frantically paddled toward the shore, but it was too late. I felt something slam into my board, knocking me into the water. In an instant, I knew it wasn't a dolphin. I saw the unmistakable gray shape of a shark circling beneath me, and all I could do was thrash around, hoping to reach the shore. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to crawl out of the water, trembling and in shock. I survived the encounter without a scratch, but the fear of being that close to a shark stayed with me for a long time. That vacation made me realize that life was too short to waste being stuck in a job I hated. Not long after, I quit my job in Indiana and moved to California, where I now work as a freelance writer.